session, we will start with Carol MacNutt from up in Boston, and also from the Forged in Fire show. She's going to tell us how they made the swords.
Thank you, George. Can you all hear me? My name is Karen MacNutt. I'm an attorney. And George likes to give me this spot after lunch. I don't know whether he thinks I'm a good speaker and will keep you awake, or whether he thinks that I'm the speaker that will allow you to have your afternoon nap. If you nap, I'm going to ask your table mates to keep an eye on you so you don't fall over. Put your head down if you want to rest. I have noted there are a number of other lawyers that have done presentations, and I would imagine out in the crowd there are other lawyers who are not willing to fess up to their profession. Well, up my way in Boston, they have a lot of medical studies, and they do medical testing, and I have been told that they've decided not to use laboratory rats anymore. That they're now using lawyers. And the reason is there are more lawyers than there are rats up here. And the lab technicians do not get attached to them like they do with rats. So, I'm going to chuckle at you. We'll now get on to a subject that might be a little dry. Just a little bit of background that you probably already know, but it's always nice to set the table. So we're all talking about the same thing. After the fall of Charlestown in 1780 in May, most of the supplies for the American Army was in Charlestown. Now, they did get some supplies out, but not a lot. There was a destruction not only of Charlestown, the capture of Charlestown, but of all the other port cities in South Carolina, and not too long after that, Wilmington, North Carolina. So there was a real disruption in supply. And of course, Gates came down with the Second Army, bringing a certain amount of supplies, and that army was destroyed in September of 1780. Shortly about that same time, Sumter was caught napping, and his group was dispersed. So things were pretty black in September of 1780. Francis Marion had escaped both these disasters. The first one because he broke his ankle and was sent home to recover. And the second one because Gates had sent him ahead of the main army to sort of act as a senior army advisor, as it were, to the Williamsburg militia that had asked for assistance because they wanted a regular officer to train them to fight the British. They thought that it was going to be a tough fight and they needed a tough person to help them lead that. With the destruction of Gates, Marion basically withdrew into North Carolina, where he linked up with two other regiments of militia. I don't think it was intentional, it just happened. The Williamsburg militia, the regiment, and the regiment, what was left of it from Georgetown, and the PG regiment sort of came together someplace between White Marsh and Wilmington, and the colonels all kibitzed together and came to the conclusion that Marion was the most experienced of the colonels, and therefore he should be the one making the decisions. If Marion had had the brass of Sumter, he would have had himself elected brigadier general at that point, because now he didn't have a regiment, he actually had 3 regiments, and that is enough to make a brigade. But he didn't do that. Marion was a professional, and as I was saying to Charles Baxley, amongst professional soldiers, they say professional soldiers talk logistics, amateurs talk strategy. And Marion was interested in logistics. The problem he faced from the beginning was a shortage of weapons. Some of his men did not have guns. James writes, and he says, I'm supposed to have a PowerPoint, so we can go to the next one. Yeah, there we go. Arms and Marriages. James talks about how some men didn't have guns, and so they would go into battle behind somebody who did have a gun, and they would hope that if their friend was shot or if an enemy soldier was shot, they could pick up a gun on the battlefield. James also recounts how Marion would line up the men that didn't have guns at a distance, sort of on the horizon, like they let the British think that maybe he had this big reserve force to make it appear he had more men than he really had. This was tough times. Even if the men had guns, there was a second problem, that they needed powder. And powder was never made in large amounts in the colonies. Most of it was imported. You had powder, you still needed lead. Lead was in short supply, and in some of our archaeological digs, we found men were taking pewter from tankards and plates, spoons, and melting it down into balls to shoot at the British. Supplies were tough. So the story, although Marion could capture some weapons and ammunition from the British, you can't capture enough to have a steady supply to run a war. It might help, but it was not reliable. So his solution, according to James, was to take saws from the local sawmills, hand them over to blacksmiths, and make swords out of them. And we were told that this supplemented Marion's weapons. Now I need an assistant here. David?
That's your sword. That's my saw. That ain't gonna work too good, is it?
I spent half the summer knowing I was going to do this, measuring saw blades all up through Maine, the big two-man saws to cut down big trees, the pit saws at the different museums. Saw blades are approximately 1/32 of an inch. Sword blades are about 1/4 of an inch. So between a saw and a sword, guess who's going to win? A sword. Now some serious historians have discounted the fact that Marion did this. Edged weapons were very important in the Revolution. The British depended upon the bayonet. And the reason is the musket was single shot, and a guy with a bayonet could run across the field and stab you and kill you if you weren't good enough to go quickly enough for the next round. So bayonets were important, and swords were important. A man on a horse with a sword could do a lot of damage. Carol and George are very nice people. So they called me up and they knew I had been doing some research on swords, and apparently they'd been watching this TV program called Forged in Fire. Anyone out there who watched that see that? So they wanted me to do this program on swords. Well, our modern contestants, if you haven't seen the program, they're 4 wannabe blacksmiths. Those that are wannabe. And the contestants are given some sort of a blade to make, and they have gas forges, they have power grinders, they have power hammers, they have arc welders, and they make this thing, and they have 3 judges, and one's a kind of oriental-looking guy, supposedly a martial arts expert, and after the contestants make their blades, they hand them over to the martial arts expert, and he's got this pig carcass hanging there, and he takes the sword, he goes, whack! He cuts the thing in half, and then he says, big smile, equal cut! And that means you can go on to the next round. What's interesting about that, first of all, if you were in battle and you did all those stupid maneuvers, somebody could kill you before you get to it. But is the amount of damage a good edge weapon can do. They can do a lot of damage. In the colonial days, they didn't have all that power equipment. They could have a power bellows or a power hammer, but they needed a water wheel, and that was a big operation. No local blacksmith is going to do that. But probably the biggest thing that they didn't have is they didn't have good metals. They didn't have good steel. Now, because my research is not complete, I'm going to rely upon a different TV show for a format, and it's a show called Mythbusters. And that's hard to say, I'll tell you. Mythbusters. Anyway, in that show, you have 2 hosts that will examine some popular saying, and they will look at it scientifically to see if it's possible. So that's the format. Now, if you haven't seen Mythbusters, the 2 programs that stand out in my mind most is the one where the fellow ate so many poppy seed bagels The question was, if he ate enough of them, would he test positive for opioids? And he ate a lot of them, and he did test positive. So as a lawyer, that meant a lot to me. Good defense. My client was eating bagels. Anyway, the second one was a question that we've all known about for years and wondered about. And yes, you can get 10 pounds of manure into a 5-pound bag, but it is very difficult. So, the question here, you can make something that looks like a sword out of wood. You can make something that looks like a sword out of metal. But would you trust your life to it on the battlefield? Will it hold up? So the question is, did Francis Marion have local blacksmiths make swords? Were the swords made from saw blades? And what did the swords look like if he did that? There have been some very imaginative local historians that have come up with things that were swords sort of with saws attached. And they wouldn't work. In fact, it is so bizarre that a lot of historians, mainline historians, say it never happened. You can't make a sword out of a saw. So I was looking through a book in Georgetown Library, and I came across a picture of this sword. And the title of the sword, the little caption said, "Sword of Sergeant Ezekiel Crawford of Marion's Brigade, made from a whipsaw by a blacksmith named Potter." Could this be one of the famed sword saws? Saw swords? Swords made from saws. So I took myself off to the Charlestown Museum to look at this thing, and it's on display. You can see it in person. And this is a close-up of it. You notice the guard has been cut out to make it lighter. The guard is made of steel, or iron anyway, not brass like a lot of swords. The sword that David had is a brass hilt, not nearly as strong as this one would be. The scabbard was still intact. So that's the grip. This is the handle. Very well-made sword. This is not something some amateur turned out in their garage. So I went to the curator and said, "What else do you know about this sword?" And he said, "Well, it was given to us a long while ago, and that's all we know about it." Okay? How do we verify this? How do we give this credence? The first thing I did is I went to the list of soldiers to see if I could find an Ezekiel Crawford in Marion's Brigade. And as hard as I looked, there are no Ezekiel Crawfords that ever served in the American Revolution in South Carolina, North Carolina, or Georgia. So that seemed to be at an end. But I am a diligent person, and I didn't give up. So I said, "Is there any Ezekiel Crawfords?" Hey, maybe they get left off the muster rolls. And there are no Ezekiel Crawfords in North Carolina, Georgia, or South Carolina of the age that they could have been a soldier in the Revolution. However, in a Crawford genealogy, I did find there was an Ezekiel Crawford born after the Revolution. Okay. His father was John Crawford, and John Crawford was of the right age to be in the Revolution. And although Ezekiel was in Georgia, John had moved to Georgia from Georgetown after the war. Back to the list of soldiers. John Crawford was in the Georgetown militia as a horseman between 1780 and 1783. That made him part of Marion's Brigade. So the sword was a sword in Marion's Brigade, not carried by Ezekiel Crawford, but by his father, John Crawford. That was neat. That's one of the swords. But now, the next question is, was the sword made by a blacksmith named Potter? Potter. There are no Potter blacksmiths in the South. There's a very, very famous, right here, Potter, cutler who made swords in New York City. And he made them for the British Army. He is well documented. His swords were the cat's meow for swords. Everybody wanted them. They were the best swords made on the continent. He made them for Tarleton's Legion. He made them for the Queens Rangers, he made them for all the Tory regiments. We are told that between 1777 and 1782, he made 1,580 swords for the British armies. So the best swords made in the continent. I am told that some survived to fight in the Civil War. Well made, everybody wanted them. Harry Lee wanted them, everybody wanted them. If an American soldier was carrying one, it was because he captured one. Potter did not make swords for the American army. However, Potter had 5 workmen, and he could make approximately 25 swords per week. Now, this is, oops, let me go back here. That's a Potter sword. Looks a lot like Crawford's sword, doesn't it? There's the grip. Same cutouts, same general design. Same general feel to the handle. This little bottle up here, that was the counterbalance. And if you get in a bad fight, you could crack somebody's skull with it. So, ladies, if you buy a cheap handbag with a fancy name on it, they call it a knockoff. So Crawford's sword was a knockoff of a Potter sword. It was a copy of the best sword made. There are no marks on Crawford's sword. If you happen to have a sword in your possession, or you know where there's one that looked like any of those swords, I want to know about it. All right? It's an important piece of history, an important story to tell. So, okay, Potter didn't make the sword, but somebody did. The Potter copy. Could a country blacksmith make one of those swords? You have to know something about blacksmiths. Blacksmiths didn't, just go out and play. If you were a blacksmith, it took 6 years of apprenticeship to become a blacksmith. I know because I used to work at Mystic Seaport Museum, and they had a real blacksmith there, and I used to go down and work with him. He explained to me that for the first year of his internship, all he made was nails. And until he could make a perfect nail, they would not allow him to go further. 6 years is like a master's degree. These guys knew all there was to know about metal, and all there was to know about making things, and they could make just about anything given enough time and given the right materials. So now we come to the next problem. We have a talented blacksmith. Could he make a sword? Well, the next problem is he needed materials. Anybody know what that is? It's a forge. It's a blast furnace, or what's left of one. In colonial times, the British had what they called a mercantile system. They did not want the Americas to make manufactured goods. They wanted you to ship raw materials to England. England would send back the manufactured goods. But there was surface iron in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, and in parts of South Carolina around the North Carolina border. And these local forges, they're not forges, blast furnaces, were built something like this. They would bring a layer of charcoal. They did not use coal. They would put a layer of charcoal in, a layer of oil, of ore in the furnace. And they could also put scrap metal in there, layer after layer after layer. They'd light the thing off. They had a bellows here. This one's operated by a water wheel. And the water wheel, of course, would pump the bellows. The bellows would make it hot enough to melt the metal. The metal would run down to the bottom. They then had a trench that came out, and little things off the side of the trench. They would open the chute, the molten metal would come out in the trench, and it would cool, and they would make cast iron. Now, the reason it was cast iron was it had a lot of carbon in it. And carbon is the impurity that makes the difference between iron, malleable iron, cast iron, and steel. Ladies, cast iron is good for what? Frying pans, stoves. But it's also good for cannonballs and cannons. The city of Boston has water pipes that are made of cast iron that are 150 years old and are still going strong. Not good for swords. Why is it not good for swords? It's brittle. You hit it, it's going to fracture. Not good sword material. So they would take the cast iron and they would put it back in the fire. They would heat it until it was yellow hot. Now they didn't know what that meant. They just meant that yellow hot was the temperature they wanted. They didn't actually know what the temperature was. The blacksmith gauged the temperature of the metal by its color. And it was like putty. And then they would beat the bejeebers out of it with a hammer. And when they did that, two things would happen. The carbon would come to the surface of the metal and slough off. And if you looked at iron under a microscope, you see all the like grains of rice. And when they, for some reason, when they beat on it, that little grain of rice would all line up. And when they got through doing that process, they had wrought iron. Now, wrought iron, you could work on an anvil, you could make it into different things, you could make door hinges, decorative gates, hooks, nails, horseshoes. But wrought iron was not good for swords. Anyone want to say why? It bends, and it won't take an edge. You don't want to get into a sword fight, whack at somebody, and then see your sword become U-shaped. It doesn't work too well. All right, so then what they would do is they would make what's called blister steel. You notice this is very labor intensive. They would take the wrought iron, they put it back in the furnace. This time they would cover it with clay, so it would have very little oxygen. They'd surround it with charcoal, they'd heat it up, and what would happen is the carbon would come to the surface of the metal, and when they took it out, the surface would be steel. All right? But the center was still wrought iron. They would do that twice. They would fold it over, weld it 2 or 3 times, and that made what's called shear steel, and that was good for knives, saws, cutting instruments, watch movements. That's what Sheffield steel, you heard of Sheffield steel knife? That's what it was. It was shear steel, and up until 1900, that was the best steel you could get. Actually, about 1950, that was the best steel you could get, shear steel. They did not make good steel in the colonies, and one of the reasons is England made much better steel, and they flooded the market with cheap steel. So steel was not really being made in the colonies. So, the problem was, if you're going to make a sword, how did you do it? Well, you took the steel and you simply welded it together. It also was too brittle. Not as brittle as the cast iron, but it was still too brittle to make a good sword. So what they did is they took 2 pieces of steel, of blister steel, or shear steel, even better, and they welded it together with a piece of wrought iron, the 3 materials together. That was difficult because the wrought iron and the steel welded at different temperatures, so the smith had to be good to do that, but that's the way they made a sword, and that's the way they made swords, functional swords, up to 1900. 2 sandwich, 2 pieces of steel, 1 piece of wrought iron. So we had George Washington set up, the colonies set up foundries to make iron and steel when the Revolution began. Big foundry right outside of Boston by Paul Revere to make cannons and cannonballs. A little place called Fort Pitt started to make a lot of iron products. Later became Pittsburgh. The foundry up at Rappahannock Forge in Virginia and at Hopewell Furnace started turning out iron and steel. And the little foundry up on the North Carolina, South Carolina border started turning that out. So, did we make swords from saws? No. But were saws used in the manufacture of swords? Yes, because the saw was the best source of shear steel that Francis Marion could lay his hands on in quantity. So yes, they went around, they collected the saw blades, they gave them to the blacksmiths to make into swords, but it was only part of the process. It was not the whole process. So, let's see. Okay. There they are. It's a blacksmith shop. He's welding. you notice the color, it's that yellow color, that's the color, the welding color. And he would be making the shear steel by doing that. So there's the Crawford sword. You notice the striations here? Those are the welds. Those are the welds where they welded the steel and the wrought iron together. From here back was wrought iron, because the wrought iron was stronger than the steel. It's a different type of strength. It would take the pounding. The steel wouldn't. So, Colonel Topham arrives in South Carolina and he visits our forges. And when he gets through visiting our forges, that's what they look like. So that increased Francis Marion's problems with getting good metals. The British made a very concerted effort to destroy any manufacturing of iron that we did. All right, now the Crawford sword was so good, I thought to myself, well, maybe they had a sword maker, an armorer in South Carolina working. There's no record that I could find in any of the published sources to this material, to that fact, but many states did. They had their own armory set to make weapons. So I went to the legislative records in South Carolina, and lo and behold, there's a Robert McElrath or McElroy who was hired by the state in 1777 to be the state armorer. Now, if you happen to own any edged weapon, or know of one, that was made by a state armorer in the Revolutionary War, I want to see it, because I've never seen one, I've never seen a picture of one, but he worked from 1777 to 1782. He hired 3 white men and 3 black men. He could have turned out as many swords as Potter did up in New York. They secured Howe, who was the general in charge down here at that time of the Continental Army, secured a house for McElrath. He secured a shop for him, and we have records of them buying iron for McElrath to work with. At the end of the war, he submitted a bill to the legislature. It was sent out to a committee headed by C.C. Pinckney. McCulloch said he made swords, bayonets, and repaired muskets. Pinckney investigated that and came back with a glowing report. You've got to pay this guy. He did great service for the state of South Carolina. Unfortunately, I don't think that he was the man who made Francis Marion's swords. He's listed as part of the Charlestown militia. He was captured in the city in May 1780. Apparently his workshop and his employees got out of the city before it fell. They went to Charlotte, North Carolina, where they continued to work. When he was released with the general release of prisoners in May 1781, he went back to work making swords and bayonets and repairing guns. And we see a letter from Thomas Sumter to General Greene saying he has moved McElrath in his project from Charlotte, North Carolina to Congaree, near where Columbia is today. And then after a while it was moved to Camden. And the only problem that he had was a lack of raw material. He needed iron and steel also. And again, about this time, we have Benedict Arnold rampaging through Virginia, burning down manufacturing plants. And of course, Tarleton has already done his deal. So who made Crawford's sword? Well, Marion's greatest need was in 1780 to 1781, that period before the capture of the inland posts. As I say, I don't think McCulloch made it. There is a letter from Peter Ory to Francis Marion in June of 1781. Peter Ory and Hezekiah Mayhem were made colonels in state troops of cavalry, and they were told to go out and raise the troops and raise the equipment. And in June, Ory writes to Marion and he says, he's going to put the blacksmiths back to work making swords. This kind of implies that he knew some people. Then later he writes Marion a complaint and he says, his smiths can't do their work because they're being drafted into the militia to serve their militia duty. They didn't have an idea of critical manpower, I guess. So Marion must have asked them for names because Ory sends Marion a list of names, and the list of names, I don't know the first names, the names for men, DeWitt, Labrell, Scott, and Neersmith. Now, I was curious as to whether or not the Crockett sword was one of a kind. You know, they're making these onesie-twosies. So I asked as many people in the museum world as I do, all the way from Williamsburg to the Military Academy, all the way up to New Brunswick in St. John Museum. And at Williamsburg, the fellow, the curator there, who was an expert on potter swords, said he knew somebody who had a look-alike of the Crawford sword. Now, experts can tell the difference. There are very subtle differences. So that's the potter sword. That's the Crawford look-alike sword. This is owned by a private collector, and it's almost identical to the Crawford sword. The other thing is, you notice, the scabbard is almost identical too. There's a separate contract in the records of South Carolina of a man who was contracted to make scabbards for the swords. Well, you can't make scabbards for a sword unless the sword is made to a pattern, or else they wouldn't fit. So we have two swords and we have two scabbards, and they all fit. This was the pattern that Francis Marion chose for his swords. And these swords were made to a pattern. And he picked the pattern that was the best sword on the market at the time, the Potter pattern. So when Crawford's relatives were told that Crawford had a Potter sword, it wasn't made by Potter, it was a Potter design. So let's go one step further, go back into what they call the indents. These are the records of people who presided, who presented bills at the end of the war. It wasn't named with state armor. We have the four people already named: DeWitt, Labrell, Scott, Neersmith. That's, by the way, the name of the four men who were Marion's bodyguard. So my understanding is that at least somebody in the family was also a blacksmith. But then we find in the other records and indents, we find David Campbell made 61 swords for state troops. William Flint made 28 broadswords for Mayo. William Stretch made swords for Mayo. Aslan Roberts made 18 swords for Hammond. Charles DeWitt made 16 swords for Marion, and Solomon Morgan made swords for Marion. So these are the blacksmiths. They're not swords makers. They're not listed as sword makers anywhere. They're not gunsmiths. They are blacksmiths. Charles DeWitt, Solomon Morgan. Blacksmiths who made swords for Francis Marion at the bleakest time in the Revolution. They made good quality blades. You wouldn't expect Marion to accept anything but the best for his troops. It was hard enough anyway. He wanted them made to a good standard. He picked the best design possible, and his smiths apparently did a good job. In Charlestown, there were sword makers. Not one of them applied to be paid for assistance to the Revolution. These are men who stepped up to the plate at an hour of desperation. So, unless you're a sword collector, you might say, why does this count for anything? Why is this significant? And it's very important. It really goes to the heart of the Francis Marion story. And that is this: some people spend their entire lives saying, I can't, I don't. I can't because I don't. I'm not big enough, I'm not small enough, I'm not strong enough, I don't have an education, I don't have the best tools, I can't. And the biggest prison that we have is the prison of our own mind. You started by saying, I can't, you can't. Francis Marion never said, I can't. Francis Marion was passionate in his beliefs about the Declaration of Independence and passionate in his beliefs about freedom, and he wasn't going to let anything get in his way. And he said, I can. What do I have? What will make it work? How can I make it work? And he made it work. He had nothing, and he made it work. And that's the story of Francis Marion. And that's why he's relevant today. Because if you are passionate in your beliefs, and you don't allow things to get in your way, you don't allow negative thoughts to get in your way, you can achieve great things. And that's the story of the swords and saws. Thank you.
very uncharacteristic Christian first name. However, especially if Solomon is very Jewish sounding.
By the way, I misspelled Roberts there on the T.O.
So one, I'm wondering if perhaps, I mean, there were some Jewish people in Georgetown. Maybe I'm just.
Unfortunately, you know, in those times, a lot of people used Old Testament names, whether they were Jewish or they were Christian. So you really can't tell from that. Mr. Morgan has no record of militia service or military service. So either he was too old or he was just strictly a blacksmith. Mr. DeWitt had records of military service. The other folks didn't. So there's no record that they were doing military service.
Just a comment, Charleston had the largest Jewish congregation in the colony, so it's not unlikely that we would have had Jews. I know we had Jews in Georgetown already.
It's very possible. And the other thing is that these blacksmiths could not have made the swords by themselves. It's probably they required 3 or 4 people. Because at some point in the life of that sword, it had to go into a forge that was long enough to take the entire length of the sword. No, I don't want that. This is a sword that was owned by it's a potter sword, owned by the